I would now like to welcome to the stage Araí Monteforte and Richard Choularton, who are both with Tetra Tech, one of our partners for today's event. So welcome both up to the stage. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
So Richard, I'm going to start with you. Tetra Tech talks about having a leading with science approach. Put that in quotes there. So what does that mean to you, and how does that impact how you approach climate?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
How about this one? Oh, that's okay. Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I was just reflecting on the conversation before. You know, Tetra Tech is a science, engineering, and environment consulting firm that came to international development 20, 25 years ago because our engineering and our science and environment work was needed by clients like USAID in their water and other programs. And so we've become a development firm grounded in science. And so for us, climate change is pretty fundamental because our core area of work is really about understanding how the environment interacts with society and trying to solve difficult problems using science. And so, you know, we work in 100 countries, 70,000 projects. About 25% of those are international development projects, and the rest are for government clients in the U.S. or the private sector. And so, what's really exciting for me as a development person is being able to reach back into our firm and pull that scientific expertise into solving problems in developing countries. And maybe I'll just give you a couple examples because it's maybe easier than to see. We were recently asked by the World Food Programme if we could assess flood, landslide, and debris flow risk in Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh. And in our part of Tetra Tech, we've got a lot of GIS capacity. We've got a lot of kind of core climate analysis capacity, but we didn't have anyone who could do a very detailed technical, geotechnical analysis of refugee camps. So we were able to pull in. I think we got 6 different PhDs in hydrology, debris flows, geotechnical engineering. We mapped every single structure in those refugee camps, the several million people living in them, all the infrastructure, and then did a 1 meter resolution analysis of flood, landslide, and debris flow risk, taking into account the impacts of climate change over the next few years on that risk, something that we would never have been able to do otherwise. In Malawi, the World Bank asked us to help them develop for the government mechanisms to scale up their shock responsive social protection system for food insecurity. And we were able to pull in modeling capacity to look at 18 different drought risk models, link that to socioeconomic variables like food security, market prices, and develop a mechanism that triggers action 9 months before food insecurity usually peaks in Malawi. So that's about 6 months before traditional measures would have taken place. So for us, it's really about taking the best possible science to solve those real world problems.
So, Araí, as Richard mentioned, you have a lot of projects globally, and you run a USAID-funded project scaling up renewable energy, which looks to reimagine national electric grids to clean energy in lower middle-income countries. In some of our earlier discussions today, we recognized this big energy crisis, and particularly coupled with some of the other crises in the world, and a need to solve that quickly with whatever means possible. So can you talk a little bit about navigating that tension and challenge of needing to get access to energy, but also wanting to make it clean energy, and how you approach that, particularly working in lower middle income countries?
Thank you, Kate. And I appreciate the question because it is our job to find solutions and seize opportunities. Um, One of the biggest challenges and most exciting ones is change. In many of the countries that we work in, they are embracing this change. They want to change their power grids from fossil fuel-based generation to clean energy like wind and solar. And they're not doing it just to meet their NDC commitments. They're doing it to address very real climate crisis impacts and energy security issues. So, for example, in South America, many large hydropower plants are not delivering electricity because of droughts, because of degradation of riverbeds. And other countries, they're very vulnerable to global price fluctuations, geopolitics, and so forth. So many of these countries are embracing change. And so the way we do this is to help them accelerate a clean energy um, and just energy transition. So we work on planning, we work on financing, and integrating social and environmental aspects and issues. So in financing, just looking at the price tag, we really need to double investments in distribution and transmission. Axes don't even count that. It's massive. And so we need to think about how to work with countries to improve their enabling environments, to create opportunities. I was just hearing this week from the Uruguay finance minister. They are creating a new framework to issue bonds that are indexed to climate change indicators. And this effectively ties domestic economic policy to cost of borrowing and to their sustainability commitments. On planning, it just determines where, how, when you're going to invest. And so we look at ways of giving the right signals to investors. For example, work with countries to develop the right skills to do this. It requires new skills. And finally, in integrating social and environmental issues, um, we just need to think of different ways of doing this and be very systematic about it. And so we, for example, Tetra Tech recently joined the 2X Collaborative, which works with a global industry organization of all ranges of investors who are working on how to increase gender smart investment. So I'm going to stop there, but yes, a lot to talk about.
Great. And Richard, so I want to bring in how you all use like data, predictive analysis. You have a lot of these resources within Tetra Tech, and maybe an example in your approach to the Horn of Africa, where I know you do work. Obviously, experienced a lot of drought, and how you are able to leverage this to work with, say, smallholder farmers. For we talked about adaptation earlier, so particularly in helping them adapt to a warming climate.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much. Yeah. It's. I mean, what's happening in the Horn of Africa, I think probably everyone here knows, is really the worst food crisis we've seen in the Horn of Africa potentially ever. And it's not the first, but it's maybe the first where there's very clear and compelling scientific evidence of the climate change impacts. Attribution science is new. It's particularly difficult in the Horn of Africa, but we're starting to see some of the initial research on the current situation come out. There's been 4 failed consecutive seasons in a row. The current short season in East Africa is off to a bad start. The forecasts have been that it's going to be bad. The forecast for the next season, the main long season, next March, April, May, is also not good. And so the kind of early warning systems that we've been working to support were originally conceived to think about like how do you deal with a drought, a single drought, or a bad year, or maybe a bad couple of years, not back-to-back consecutive droughts that go on for extended periods of time that are quickly followed by more droughts. So, you know, the ability to understand the risks in the future has fundamentally changed. We can't look at the past anymore to predict what's going forward. And so we've been doing a lot of work to try and use predictive analytics, particularly in agriculture, to provide both a level of detail and granularity in analytics, but also to push projections further into the future. And so, you know, when I started working in climate change, it was because I was trying to figure out what was happening in pastoral areas of the Horn of Africa, where we kept hearing there's more frequent droughts. There was what was called at the time the pastoral dropout crisis, where pastoral communities were moving away from pastoralism into towns, creating all kinds of new problems. And that is essentially unplanned adaptation to a changing climate. And the kind of data we had was very coarse. We could see 25-kilometer blocks of the Earth from satellites. And now we're in a totally different place. We've got high-resolution satellites that provide data down to centimeters in some cases, meters in many cases. And we have the analytical computing power to do predictive analytics that we didn't have before. So you can, if you have the right data and analytics, do much more to identify where fields are, what's being grown in them, what the yields are likely to be at a level that can support a smallholder. So there are all kinds of applications for that kind of information. So, for example, you can provide pastoralists with high-resolution analysis of their grazing areas, so that they can manage how they send out scouts to determine whether they're going to send their cows there, or whether they send their sheep and goats, who eat everything, there directly. You can work with input suppliers, so that their retail extension agents can text their clients and say, hey guys, there's a higher risk of downy mildew on your tomato crop this week. I'm coming to do a seminar on how to treat that and sell their product. At the national level, you can do much more predictive early warning to inform policy. So we're working with COMESA and AGRA to develop a system that uses machine learning and artificial intelligence to predict food stocks and food balances at the national level based on production and trade and prices and a whole series of other variables, so that they can make decisions about whether they procure more food earlier, what they do with trade policy, when it makes sense to open borders so that trade can flow more easily from areas of surplus to deficit. So the kind of data and analytics we have now are totally essential for us to be much more agile in a future that is going to be riskier, more volatile, with more climate shocks.
And for both of you, in our last couple of minutes here, what are you hoping to see happen over these next couple of weeks? And Araí, what would mean a successful COP to you? What do you want to see to say, okay, we're making progress?
So, I mean, I certainly want us to see leading with science, but especially with determination. Um, you know, messages to governments is improve your enabling environments and integrate social and environmental aspects. But to the global financiers, you know, we need to get more creative on how we meet the needs of countries and communities. We need to just be riskier and to meet those needs. So thanks.
How about you, Richard?
Oh, I have a long list of things that I would like to see. Um, I'm going to cheat. I'll do two things if that's okay. I mean, the first thing is I really hope that the discussion on implementation takes hold. I guess this is my eighth COP. And the process can be quite glacial, and there are always calls to action.
Does it feel like Groundhog's Day and same?
No, I mean, it's a longer discussion. I think there's some real real progress being made here. I think the kind of rules of the road of Paris have settled in, and we're seeing a new wave of really difficult issues being addressed, like loss and damage is being addressed in a different way. For example, but to do that, I think there's two things that I really hope the parties especially focus on. One is meaningful ways to improve local capacities to implement climate action, and I mean that at multiple local levels. So yes, national governments, which tends to be the focus of the party-led conversations here, but communities, municipalities, cities, civil society, more direct ways to support them to drive their own climate action, I think is essential. And that the UNFCCC process in general tends to be complex and create barriers for those people who most need to take climate action to be empowered by the process. So I think we really need to see more of that. And the second thing is the process tends to be quite introverted, and for good reason. But now we're into implementation. The whole notion of the COP process working outside the COP process and facilitating and encouraging and enabling action outside the process is so critical. So working with multilateral development banks, with bilateral donors, with the private sector, with academia, with civil society, for them to drive climate action in a more consolidated and coherent way is pretty essential. And I think there's more they could do to say, like, hey, one issue I've been working on this week is loss and damage finance, and so the humanitarian finance system needs totally reforming in order to respond to the risks of climate change, and the parties here need to be calling on their colleagues who work on that process to reform that system so it can do its job more effectively. So I'd like to see more of that.
All right, well, we'll save that for another discussion. But thank you, Richard Araí, for your time today, and thank you to Tetra Tech for being a partner for today's event.
Thank you.
Thank you.